Let's be frank, it's a concerning time for all of us as coronavirus numbers rise in the face of lockdowns. This video hopes to dispel some of the fear-mongering of the right-wing media and analyse just how they're getting their message across. Let's start with a fact. To keep COVID under control, Australia's growth factor needs to remain below 1.0. It was at its lowest, 0.87, on April 26th, shortly after Victoria entered lockdown on the back of a spike of cases that took the growth rate to a high of 1.28. Long story short, if we're above the number of 1, the case numbers are going up and we're not on top of the outbreak. It's this metric that a lot of the CMOs are taking into account when they are analysing COVID and their response. But you wouldn't know it, with the right-wing Murdoch media, in particular Sky News, flooding the media with conservative opinion and a strong bias against lockdowns and the country's elimination plans against the virus. We took a deep dive at some of the most recent Sky News broadcasts, and in particular what each commentator had to say on the matter. Peter Credlin begins honestly enough by trying to establish that people shouldn't be coerced into getting the jab. That's absolutely correct, and we at Politichosis cannot agree more. But it's quickly used as a vehicle to attack the vaccination plan, with Sky News host Rowan Dean going on the attack, saying that allowing vaccinated people to be eased off of restrictions is in breach of the Geneva Declaration and the Helsinki Declaration.
Vaccinated people within Australia will be free of the restrictions, whereas other Australians won't. That's two classes of Australians, completely unacceptable. And as I've said before, it goes against the Helsinki Declaration, it goes against the Geneva Declaration if a government or a bureaucrat starts coercing any individual to take any drug against that individual's specific wishes.
Dean is pulling at strings here. The WMA Declaration of Geneva, first ratified in 1948, with the most recent revision in 2006, is an extension of the Hippocratic Oath. It binds a member of the medical profession with an extended list of principles that all doctors should go by. The government isn't telling doctors to force the jab, nor are they affecting their decisions. The Helsinki Convention covers medical research, so it's also completely redundant. The video then turns to paid vaccination leave, and Credlin & Co suddenly turn on the vitriol against the sworn enemy of the Conservative Empire, the Labor Party and the union movement in Australia.
Whistling by the Labor Party, to woo the public servants, make sure they shore up the vote. And of course the unions. The unions want to make sure that they justify the membership dollars and make themselves relevant, so they're going out for it. It's absolutely absurd. The rest of us do it in our lunch hour or after work, and we take our sick leave.
And of course, the National Cabinet has come under scrutiny for giving premiers too much power. I can only wonder which ones they're referring to. In another segment, AI Group CEO Innes Wilcox spoke the possibility of business playing a role in COVID vaccination and acting on vaccination data. Credlin falls short of supporting the idea, but also doesn't vilify it, despite any other segment going on the front of coercion against vaccination. It's no surprise that AI Group is a benefactor of the Liberal government, with $14.3 million from the Australian federal government showing up in their 2019 statements. So it's no surprise that the Murdoch bandwagon went easy on him.
And the like, with the unions claiming that up to 40% of the workforce is in insecure work and need to be put into permanent work. We've had works with unions before, and they weren't as successful as we would have wanted because the unions didn't actually kick into that.
Let's add another to the tally of union and Labor barbs. We then scooch across and check out Andrew Bolt, who's having a chinwag with Southern Conservative darling Mark Latham. Let's not forget that this man was also once the darling of the Labor Party and the unions, and as Helen Dalton aptly put it, was one bad handshake away from being Prime Minister. In an interview as out of touch as the Skype call that Latham was on, Latham goes on the attack of state premiers, hypocritically saying that politicians are on a power drug and infers abuse of powers.
But the serious point is that the old adage that if you give politicians power, they want more power, And there's no doubt that the state premiers in particular, in being able to control our movements, our activities right down to what we do when we're shopping, this is a power drug on which they've consumed plenty of it.
He even says it encourages the left to push policies that he doesn't agree with, such as climate change. There's also a subtle yet irrelevant dig at Bruce Pascoe's claims to Aboriginality. It seems that Bolt is still seething over that 2012 piece by Pascoe on him. This footage starts with University of Queensland professor James Allen, who claims that reports have said that the Delta variant is 30% more lethal. That's a figure that, when put into Google, doesn't actually show up. So we're going to infer that it's wrong. It's never been put out in the press that this is the case, and Allen is simply drawing a figure out of thin air. The WHO has declared that the Delta variant is actually 50 to 60% more transmissible than the Alpha variant, which was originally more than 50 to 60% more transmissible than the original COVID-19 virus. Allen also declares that the media is predominantly of a left-wing ideological position. Perhaps he needs to remember who his employer is. In his closing comments, Jones goes on a vitriolic rant and begins to claim that the recent lockdown procedures are over-governance and martial law masquerading as medical law.
Make no mistake, the over-governance and disproportionate measures we see today in order to respond to a virus is a case of martial law masquerading as medical law. Measures like standing 1.5 metres away from someone, for God's sake, mandatory mask wearing, limits on visitors to your home, only allowed to leave for certain reasons.
Restrictions such as mask wearing and social distancing are in the firing line, as Mr. Jones labels them as North Korean stuff. He openly voices his disappointment in the New South Wales Liberal Party, claiming it was a party built on freedom. Perhaps he needs to check what conservative politics in Australia actually is. Hilariously, Jones compares QR codes to George Orwell's 1984. Consistently bring up Big Brother, but perhaps the most concerning is that Jones uses his soapbox to downplay COVID-19, citing a low death rate and the need for testing to establish that you have it. The QR codes then get another hilarious comparison to Stalinism, following a barb at the WA Labor government and its use of the Safe WA data. Now on to Chris Kenny, who is joined by Pauline Hanson to discuss COVID and in particular the halving of Australian incoming arrivals. Hanson often champions the Australian predisposition and claims it breaks her heart to see people stuck overseas because of the cut in arrivals back in Australia.
Now, it's a shame that they can't get back here purely because of hotel quarantine. They've got nowhere to put them. If these people have been tested negative for COVID, if they've had the vaccination, which we're all being told have the vaccination and we will all be safe. If that be the case, Chris, why are we stopping them from actually coming home? If they've had the vaccination, if they are tested negative, why can't they actually go back to their own homes and quarantine in their own homes with the undertaking they will not go out into the public? Bring the Australians home. I just cannot see this still going on. It's rubbish. I'm hearing that the rest of the world, New York is open up, you know, it's all getting back to business, but here we are still in lockdown for just a few cases throughout the country. I think it's ridiculous the way this has been handled.
If only it were that simple. The most recent lockdown in WA was caused by a Delta variant infected individual who tested negative in New South Wales. They caught a plane and then tested positive in Western Australia. Perhaps the most worrying comment, though, is Hanson implying that medical professionals are not being honest and are simply toting the line of it's the right thing to do due to a change in circumstance and a reduced death rate. That's not the case at all. The reason we have a reduced rate is because of our zero tolerance reaction to coronavirus. We shut down, eliminate it, and start back up again. That's why our death rate isn't as high as overseas per capita. Countries are opening up shop overseas, but they have some of the highest rates of death per capita in the world.
Now, I started the program talking about the reason we're locked down, the reason the public is so compliant, and that is that they are fearful.
He goes on to quote in another segment, according to True North Strategy, that 38% of the population believe that the Delta variant is more deadly and more contagious. He claims that this is erroneous and implies that our 3% mortality rate is acceptable within global margins. I'm not kidding you here.
People actually think that if they get this thing, they will die. Now, the reality is that the case fatality rate in Australia over the past year and a half is about 3%, and that's about what it's been in countries that have been hard hit in Europe and North America. But of course, most of the victims were last year in Victoria, mainly in elderly cohorts and mainly those in aged care homes.
All in the name of anti-fear-mongering, allegedly. He's then joined by Nick Cater, who echoes his concerns about, well, concerns.
Well, it was plain to me there was a lot of panic and concern out in the community that's way out of proportion to the actual threat. But I had no idea until I saw this polling conducted this week that it was that high.
So what's the issue here? Well, let's see where this data is based from. True North Research is a for-profit research business that has appeared in Murdoch Rags, Murdoch and Nine owned radio, and Murdoch Television. See the trend here? And then you've got the Menzies Research Centre, which is an independent think tank associated with the Liberal Party of Australia. And that's who Nick Cater was representing. Paul Murray seems to blur the line of political news satirist and analyst for the sake of argument. Let's call him a commentator. Straight away in this footage, the gusto is there. The state premiers are starting to crack. It's swiftly followed by a justification of him poking fun at Steve Marshall, who he calls Premier Marshmallow, and his chief medical officer, and then a joke about Anastasia Palaszczuk and her ignorance of a Sunrise reporter at a press conference. All this is allegedly proof that the premiers are cracking, and then, in arguably the funniest part of the segment, goes on to challenge this.
And the bloke, who of course will be the next Premier of Queensland because they own the media up there, and when you feed people the diet of mushrooms, guess what happens? He thinks the most evil people are the people who are in Australia who go overseas and then come back to Australia.
International borders are supposed to be closed, but every week thousands of people are allowed to travel. 190 international travellers arrived into Queensland yesterday. 121 international travellers arrived into Queensland yesterday. 190 are expected to arrive today, and these are putting our community at an unacceptable risk.
Damn those people! How dare you come and go from your own country? What about if one of those people was the Premier of Queensland, who's currently in Australia, but he's going to go to Japan and then has to come back to Australia? Is she part of the problem, Milesy?
Really, does it need to be spelled out? Obviously, politicians get exemption for international travel. It's a requirement of good governance. Politichosis is firm in its belief that the slashing of international arrivals is important to reduce the strain on hotel quarantine. Murray laughs about how high-priced hotels could be an option, but they aren't because of dollars. That's because at the end of the day, those dollars are being charged back to the person in hotel quarantine. And if they can't afford it, those unpaid bills, and there's a lot of them, are being paid by the taxpayer. Just ask the WA state government. The numbers have also been discussed on Paul Murray Live nightly, arguing that the premiers are power hungry and thumping the panic button, with Murray inferring that the premiers are generating hysteria. Perhaps we are yet to convince you of the right-wing-led Murdoch media bias that Sky News has been dishing out. If that's the issue, this case surely has to convince you. The last of Sky News mouthpieces that we'll discuss today in front of the camera is Cory Bernardi. Yes, that's the same Make America Great Again hat wearing, right-wing former senator that was that conservative he broke off from the Liberal Party to form his own Conservative Party, and that was swiftly voted out of office. So naturally, the country's most well-known climate change-hating libertarian hates lockdown, and has his mate from the right-wing think tank IPA, that's the Institute of Public Affairs, Gideon Rosner on the show, to help trumpet these views. We may do a video later on right-wing think tanks, but Rosner and the Murdoch media have a long history of working together to fight climate change, lockdowns, and anything else that the Conservatives don't like. Rosner is also a Liberal Party member who failed to gain pre-selection for the Victorian state seat of Burwood. So, what do they have to say?
Even the WHO, the brains trust that is the WHO, the World Health Organization, said lockdowns are not recommended in any circumstances. What changed was that when the Wuhan outbreak occurred possibly after the lab leak, Xi Jinping imposed lockdowns, and they were based not on any, actual epidemiological advice, but on his personal philosophy of Feng Kong, which is basically health security. The same philosophy, by the way, that he's used to justify the quarantine of 1 million Uyghur Muslims because on the basis they're infected with extremism. Now, what happened then was that China broadcast images to the world via social media of people being welded into their apartment buildings in the city of Wuhan. And unfortunately for us, instead of Western leaders looking at this and saying, oh my God, that's terrible, it would never happen in a free country, they actually said to themselves, well, gee, that looks like a pretty good idea, we better do that too.
Well, Mr. Rosner, that's just not true. Whilst the World Health Organization recommends against lockdowns, it notes the only time we believe a lockdown is justified is to buy you time to reorganize, regroup, rebalance your resources, protect your health workers who are exhausted. And that's according to their special envoy, Dr. David Nabarro. And even then, it only recommends that lockdowns aren't the primary control method. It isn't. Vaccination is. Social distancing is. And the fact it has been so is only a detriment to the federal government. The World Health Organization has been advocating for contact tracing, hygiene, and isolation since the beginning of the pandemic. This is nothing new despite what Rosner and Bernardi imply. Rosner then goes on some dribble about the Public Health Brigade not caring about the mental health of the citizens of Australia, despite long-term advocacy and ongoing awareness of the issues that loneliness causes in lockdown. And finally, he suggests this.
And I think it's time, and I've said this on Twitter this week, I think it's time after all this is over for somebody on behalf of the broader political class to offer up a national apology to the Australian people for the crimes against Australians that have been committed during this awful coronavirus saga.
Well, we're sorry, Gideon. Sorry that we had to listen to that garbage. Next up, Bernardi is joined by Key and Hussey of the IPA. Yep, the IPA are back, ladies and gents. Key and Hussey says that the public servants who impose lockdowns on ordinary Australians are risk-averse talkers who are detached from material reality and spend all day sitting behind laptops.
Elite class, the people who think they know better than everyone else, tell others how they should be living their lives, that telling them they should be making all these sacrifices, which none of them are prepared to do themselves. I mean, there's no greater example than what we've seen with the coronavirus panic, is it? We're getting all the bureaucrats telling us how to live our lives. Well, they're not impacted one bit. Their pay packets keep coming through and they're not in small business employing people. It's a real example of the sorts of problems we have in this country, isn't it?
That's exactly right, Corey. And IPA research throughout the coronavirus pandemic has shown that public servants have actually received pay rises.
The irony of this is delicious, as once again a spanner is thrown at the unions, with Hussey amusingly saying this.
Any Australian out there, any tradie out there knows that things aren't what they used to be in this country. We've become bogged down in red tape and compliance officers and union reps on site and all these different managers who all seem to just stand around talking for a living rather than actually, picking up the tools and building something.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's not just red tape, it's black tape and green tape and every other colour tape, because they just seem to want to keep those in business and those who want to look after themselves on the back foot. It's really become a managerial class elitism that is, I think, going to send us backwards at a rate of knots.
Corey, weren't you for 30 years a part of the Liberal Party, the same Liberal Party that implemented work choices, that reduced business tax, that saw more of the management class rise? Seems a little bit hypocritical to me. But it's not just the televisual medium that Sky is broadcasting their anti-lockdown COVID agenda. There are a few, but perhaps the most vitriolic of them all has been Sophie Ellsworth, whose tweets often get a range of angry responses. The media writer for The Australian for weeks criticised lockdowns and masks in Victoria to the point where she openly praised New South Wales for not having lockdowns, only for them to, have one. Even days before the New South Wales lockdown, she was sproiking Berejiklian's leadership from the front, only for it to spectacularly backfire. Now it's tweets on Twitter about masks, jab selfies, and an obsession with how many humans were in ICU. Well, they're not going to be cats and dogs in ICU, Sophie. These tweets are the dog's breakfast, and are a proponent of the right-wing induced media bias. So there we have it. The creme de la creme of Sky News and their thoughts on the COVID-19 pandemic. Is this sort of bias dangerous? Is the delivery pandering to the right-wing minded? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear both sides of the argument.